Okay, great. Yeah, thanks to all you guys for coming in a little early because mine's been running about a minute late, so take up a little of your time, but I'll try to talk quick. Before I get started, I'd like to thank our funders, particularly the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, but as well as UPM Blandon and NCASI. So I'll be talking about 3 different bird species that are of conservation concern. So to get started, let's just introduce you to this. So starting with American woodcock. So American woodcock is a game bird here in Minnesota. Its populations have declined by over 30% in the last 50 years, and about 10% of its population breeds in Minnesota. Second, the golden-winged warbler, which is a very pretty songbird that's here in the States. It's actually one of the most critically threatened birds in North America, and its global population is estimated to be only about 400,000 individuals, and about 50% of those breed in Minnesota. So this is a particularly important state for this species. And then finally, we have our VEER, which is a thrush, and that's seen 40% declines, and approximately 6% of its population is here in Minnesota. So apart from being of conservation concern, another thing that these species share is that they're thought to be at their highest densities in young forests in Minnesota. When a patch of forest is clear cut, one of the first species you might see show up there would be male American woodcocks displaying in the spring. And when we go in and do bird surveys, oftentimes we see or hear more often male golden-winged warblers and VEER in these stands right away. But we need to know a little bit more than just what male birds like if we're going to turn these declines around on these species. And to do that, we really want to look at the breeding season. This is the only season in which we can add birds to the population, and so it is particularly important. Within the breeding season, we have 2 different sort of sections, which is first is the nesting season, when the birds are actually in their nest, and second would be the post-fledging season, after the birds leave the nest to dispersal. Nesting season is pretty well studied, but post-fledgling is very understudied life stage, and we don't know a ton about it. So the goals of our project was to quantify the nesting habitat, nest success, and juvenile survival for our focal species, quantify habitat use of juveniles post-fledging, and then provide breeding cycle habitat management recommendations for managing landscapes to maximize productivity and conservation. For this talk, I'm going to skip the nest success part. It's very interesting, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it afterwards. But for the sake of time, we're just going to look at juvenile survival. So our study area was on UPM Blandon land, sort of near Grand Rapids. It's a long-term site that we've done surveys on in the past, so we knew all these birds were there. Within the site, we did systematic nest searching, making sure to cover ground in all the different habitat types relatively evenly. For woodcocks, we used dogs to find the nests, and then the hatchlings afterwards. And you can see one of the dog's tracks on the side there of the screen. And for the 2 passerine species, the 2 songbird species, we used trained observers to follow the adults back to the nest. Once we found the nest, we would monitor them for either success or predation. And at the time that the nestlings got near fledge, I would go to the nest and attach very lightweight radio transmitters to them that we would then use to track them every day after they were out of the nest to obtain use locations. So when we found the bird, we would take a telemetry or a GPS right where they were, that we would then go back to the next day to do a vegetation survey, both at that telemetry point, but also at a random point 30 meters away to help quantify forest vegetation characteristics. So here's a little bit a zoomed in look at the habitat matrix on our site. Within that red polygon is our actual nest searching area. And then outside of that is just places that the juvenile birds went to after they sort of left the primary study area. What you'll see is that there's early successional in the sort of lighter green all the way to mature forest in the darker green. And any bird that nested within our plot had access to all of these habitat types based on how the distances that they move. We mapped all of these sort of polygon edges of the three successional classes on the ground, but we also used a cluster analysis to verify that each patch belonged in the group. And we saw these main sort of habitat or successional types. Early successional was defined by low or no canopy cover, high stem counts, with stems being anything below 3 inches DBH, and their average height of the trees there was about 3 meters. Mid-successional had high canopy cover with medium to high stem counts and an average height of about 12 meters. And in that picture, you can see that tower is about 20 feet tall. So that gives you an idea of the sort of scale of those forests. Then the mature forests had very high canopy cover, low stem counts, very open understory, and then average heights of about 18 meters. So let's look at some habitat use for all 3 of our species. So we tagged 31 American woodcock hatchlings and got 562 telemetry detections for that species. There's 9 predations, which gave us a hatchling survival rate of about 71%. The map down at the bottom shows the movements of one of the broods of American woodcock, and if we expand that and take a look, the black spot is a nest, and then the stars are the movements every day. Right now, what you're seeing is the brood, which is 3 birds moving together with the female across the habitat, which they did until the female left and they were independent, which they split up, which is right now, and they sort of move their separate ways and actually stay in the area sort of for quite a bit of time, but the batteries eventually die, and that is when we stop tracking them. So if we look at their habitat use, first of all, I'll point out the legend there. So early successional is going to be that green color. Mid-successional is the red, and the mature is blue. That's going to be consistent throughout this presentation, so just keep that in mind. And then we see with woodcock, most of the detections were in that mid-successional forest class, with a little bit in the mature. If we look at our predations, most of the predations also occur where we get most of the detections, which makes quite a bit of sense, with some in that early successional. And so to sort of compare the, if you want to call it dangerousness of each of these forest classes, we created a ratio down at the bottom. This is basically the number of predations per the number of detections. And you can see that early successional really stands out as being placed as dangerous for woodcock. If we look at this across the ages of the birds, with woodcock, you don't see a lot of change by age. They pretty much like the habitat they like, which is mid-successional. There's 2 vertical lines on this figure. The red one indicates when the birds can fly well. For actually none of the species we look at, when they leave the nest, they can fly very well. For woodcock, it's about 15 days. For the other one, it only takes a couple of days, but that red line is what that indicates. The blue line is independence from the parents. So if we look at mortality, what we have here on the y-axis is cumulative mortality. So you can see most of the mortality in woodcock occurs before they can fly, which makes quite a bit of sense. Switching to golden wing warbler, we had 16 fledglings tagged, 199 telemetry detections, 7 predations for a fledgling survival rate of 56.2%. If we look at this animation here, so with the golden wings, they're a little different than the woodcock. They immediately split up, so we see there was a mortality in that brood early on, and then the other 2 sort of move their separate ways and disperse. The one just dispersed off to the left, and this one hangs out for a little bit longer before it decides to disperse. So for golden wings, like the woodcock, they seem to really like the mid-successional habitat, but they do tend to use the other 2 habitat classes much more than the woodcocks do. You can see predations look that pie chart looks pretty similar to the detections, which bears out in the ratio below, with mid-successional being sort of the most dangerous, but the other 2 classes aren't terribly far. Unlike woodcock, as we look at age, the forest type that they like does change with age, with the birds using more early successional habitat types early on, and then switching towards more mature forest as they get older. Mortality, most of the mortality again occurs before the birds are able to fly. So if we look at these two figures sort of side by side, most of that mortality, if we want to reduce that mortality, we should probably manage for the early and mid-successional stages, because that's where most of this mortality is occurring in those early stages. With VEER, we had 35 fledglings that we tagged, got 384 telemetry detections, 6 predations with a very high survival rate of 82.9. VEER, if we look at the way they move, they have a little bit more confusing movements. They sort of come in and out as a brood. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're separate. And they also disperse very quickly compared to the other species, which is why they like the other species, mid-successional seems very important. You see most of the detections there. With predations, again, mostly in mid-successional, but you can see there's quite a bit in early successional. Is a high percentage of the mortalities, which bears out again in that detection ratio where you see early successional stands being the most dangerous for this species. VEER sort of have the opposite pattern by age as golden wings, where they seem to start in more the later successional stands and then move into younger stands as they get older. And for them, 100% of the mortality occurs before they fly. Once they fly, they seem to be. So again, if we compare those 2 later successional stands may be the most important to manage to reduce VEER mortality. So some conclusions on the habitat use section here. Mid-successional stands seem to be very important for all species. That's where most of the detections are. Early successional stands seems to be places of high fledgling mortality, particularly for American woodcock and VEER. And American woodcock seem to really prefer mid-successional stands, but the other 2 stand types do seem to be important for golden wing warbler and for VEER. So next, to sort of finish off this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about microhabitat use. We went into each of these sort of broader habitat classes and used our telemetry and random points to sort of try to suss out what the microhabitat these birds are using within each of the stands. To do that, we use generalized linear mixed models to compare the telemetry points to the random points. And this is a preliminary analysis that we just used the variables that you can see on the screen there. So total canopy cover, average leaf litter depth, the total number of both coniferous and deciduous trees. And so these would be canopy trees as opposed to total stems, which is sort of a sub-canopy, again, under 3 inches DBH. And then ground cover in the form of grass, leaves, and logs. And then finally, our random effects for individual and brood, which we actually saw no influence of either of those random effects. So here I'll be showing you only the variables that came out as statistically significant. That estimate number, if that number is positive, which actually all of them are going to be, that means that there's a positive relationship between the birds using the site and the variable. So for instance, within mid-successional stands, woodcocks prefer places with higher canopy cover, higher total stem counts, and higher log cover. These seem to be related with cover and protection from predators, as well as in mature stands, which isn't quite significant, but near significant is that total stems again, which I assume they're using to hide from predators. If you think that picture on the side is just a picture of leaves, there's actually 3 woodcock there. There's a female in the middle and then two. So for golden wings, they didn't seem to be any microhabitat preference with the variables we looked at in early and mid-successional, but within mature stands, we saw total stems, higher areas of higher total stems and areas of higher conifer trees come out significant. Total stems as conifer trees is not something we think of golden wing warblers as being associated with. Again, mature forest is sort of the habitat they use the least. And I think what this is actually saying is in that very, very open habitat that they maybe like a little bit less trees, the clumps of conifers provide sort of a source of cover. So I think in that stand, at least, that may be what they're looking for. Across all habitat types, you see total stems being very significant. So again, total stems, very important for cover for this species.
Ryan, about a minute or a minute and a half.
Okay, great. I'm getting towards the end. So finally, VEER, in mid-successional stands, deciduous trees, high areas of high deciduous trees and high stem counts seem to be very important for this species. And again, I think we're looking at cover from predators again here, with stems again being an important factor. And like the woodcock, if you were looking at the picture on the side, hopefully you saw this little veery doing its best impression of a stick. These species are not particularly easy to find out in the woods. So to wrap things up, a little bit, some conclusions about microhabitat use. So within the available habitats, each species appears to be selecting for cover to hide from predators. Stem density, it seems to be a very important source of cover for all species. And logs may be very important for woodcocks in the early stages of the breeding season. Sort of observationally, when the woodcock leave the nest, there are no leaves on anything at that point. And they seem to use those logs much more often in that sort of season. And so before there's leaves, the logs may be a super important source of cover. So some management implications from this research. Management for a matrix of successional classes is probably very important. Woodcock don't use them as much, but especially for the other two species, although mid-successional forests are what they use the most, they definitely are using the other forests and are transitioning between successional classes. Although all three species are thought to be early successional species based on where we see adult males, mid-successional forests seem to be the most important habitat type for all three post-fledging. So that's very interesting. All three species tend to benefit from high stem counts throughout the forest succession. In our clear cuts, it was mostly aspen, but hazel was a very common species in the other successional classes. And so it may be an important plant for cover there. And then finally, leaving logs after cuts would benefit American woodcock. These definitely don't have to be like big timber logs. Things like thick branches with, with forks in them and stuff like that were mostly what they were using. So something like that left on the landscape would benefit that species. So finally, I'd be happy to take any questions from everybody in the questions section or when we have our breakout groups. If you think of something later, feel free to email me. My email is there, but is also with my app. If you want to continue the discussion, I'd be